Friends, colleagues, brothers, and sisters, thank you for being here. Let me begin with a simple, direct statement. People have no idea what's about to happen. And that's not because people aren't smart or because they don't care. It's because we live in a system, an economic and political system that has every interest in keeping people in the dark. If you want a hook, here it is. The ground beneath us is shifting, but most of us are being told to stare at the sky. What do I mean? For decades, the American working class has been squeezed, wages flat, debts rising, jobs shipped overseas, communities hollowed out, and at the very same time, the richest 1% have accumulated obscene levels of wealth. They've built fortunes so large they can buy politicians, media outlets, and even the narratives that define what we believe is possible. Yet, here's the truth. That arrangement is cracking. The inequality is unsustainable. The debts are unpayable. And the anger bubbling beneath the surface is undeniable. People have no idea what's about to happen because they've been trained not to see it. Consider the strikes erupting across industries, the quiet quitting, the mass resignations. These are not isolated blips. They are signals. They are the rumblings before the earthquake. People are rediscovering their power. They're realizing that corporations cannot function without workers. They're beginning to ask questions, dangerous questions about why democracy supposedly stops at the workplace door, why a handful of executives can dictate the future of millions. That's not business as usual. That's the beginning of something bigger. But let me also be clear. When systems are pushed to their breaking point, they can collapse in more than one direction. If people remain unaware, if they remain passive, then the crisis we face, climate catastrophe, inflation, housing shortages, political dysfunction, these will be used to push people further into fear and division. The ruling class is already preparing for that. But if people wake up, if they connect the dots, if they understand their collective strength, then what's about to happen could be transformative. We could break the stranglehold of corporate capitalism. We could finally move toward an economy organized not for profit, but for human need. The reality that most people are unaware of the true depth of the crisis we face is not an accident, nor is it the result of individual ignorance. It is the outcome of a deliberate and structured process in which those who hold power, economic, political, and cultural, have invested heavily in shaping the way the public perceives events, challenges, and possibilities. When I say the system is hiding the crisis, I am referring to the way our society has been organized to ensure that the majority of people are distracted, misinformed, or pacified precisely at the moment when clarity and awareness are most urgently needed. The first way this happens is through control of information. In today's media landscape, the dominant voices are not neutral observers of social reality. They are owned and financed by the very corporations that profit from maintaining the status quo. Networks, newspapers, digital platforms. These are not instruments designed to empower the public with knowledge. They are instruments designed to sell advertising, to deliver audiences to corporate sponsors, and above all, to prevent people from questioning the economic system that underpins it all. Stories about celebrity scandals, partisan squabbles, or stock market tickers are pushed to the forefront, while the structural crises of debt, inequality, or ecological collapse are buried, simplified, or framed as if they were natural disasters beyond human control. Second, There is the deliberate framing of economic pain as personal failure rather than systemic design. Workers who cannot keep up with rising rents and medical bills are told they did not work hard enough, did not manage their money well, or failed to skill up in an economy that leaves them behind. The dominant ideology insists that problems are individual. Your debt, your job insecurity, your stress, not collective, and certainly not the product of capitalism's relentless drive for profit at the expense of human needs. In this way, people are kept from seeing that their struggles are shared by millions and that the root causes are not personal shortcomings, but systemic contradictions. Third, the system deploys distraction as a strategy of control. A population that is constantly immersed in entertainment, consumer spectacle, and manufactured outrage has little energy left to critically examine the structures of power that govern their lives. Notice how quickly mass attention is shifted from one news cycle to the next, often over trivial issues, while deeper stories like the widening wealth gap or the erosion of labor rights barely register. This is not merely poor journalism. It is an intentional strategy to ensure that public consciousness never lingers long enough on the real fault lines in our society. Fourth, there is the matter of education. For generations, the American educational system has trained citizens not to think critically about economics, politics, and history, but to accept authority, memorize facts, and prepare for employment. Very few Americans leave school with even a basic understanding of how capitalism functions, how wealth is generated and distributed, or how alternative systems have existed throughout history. By ensuring that economic literacy is scarce, the system guarantees that when crises emerge, people lack the tools to understand them, let alone to imagine alternatives. And finally, there is the role of fear. The system thrives on convincing people that change is dangerous, that challenging the status quo will bring chaos or even disaster. Workers are told that without corporations they would have no jobs. Communities are told that without billionaires they would have no investments. And entire nations are told that without capitalism they would collapse. Fear becomes the glue that holds together a fragile order. Instead of recognizing their own potential power, people retreat into resignation, believing that however bad things may be, they could always get worse. When all of these mechanisms work together, control of information, the framing of suffering as individual fault, distraction, miseducation, and fear, they produce a society where people have no idea what's about to happen. They cannot see the structural cracks widening because their gaze has been carefully directed elsewhere. And yet, those cracks are real. The system is hiding the crisis, not because the crisis is avoidable, but because it is inevitable. What is at stake is not whether change is coming, but whether the public will be prepared to confront it with clarity and purpose or remain blindfolded until it is too late. The scale of inequality that exists today has reached proportions that can no longer be dismissed as the normal functioning of a modern economy. What we are living through is not a passing phase, not a temporary imbalance that will correct itself with time, but the culmination of decades of deliberate policy, choices, and economic structures designed to favor a small minority at the expense of the majority. For most working people, wages have been stagnant for nearly half a century, even as their productivity has increased, meaning they have been producing more wealth, but receiving less of it in return. At the same time, the costs of living, housing, healthcare, education, transportation have steadily risen, forcing families into cycles of debt simply to maintain what used to be considered a basic standard of living. This widening gap is not just about numbers in a statistical report. It is about how entire societies are reshaped when wealth accumulates so dramatically at the top. The richest individuals and corporations now hold levels of wealth that allow them to dictate the terms of political debate, to shape laws in their favor, and to shield themselves from the consequences of the very crisis they helped create. While millions of Americans worry about affording rent or covering a medical emergency, billionaires are buying political influence, building private bunkers, and investing in speculative markets that extract value without producing anything tangible. This is not an accident of capitalism. It is the design of capitalism in its current form, where the profit motive overrides every other social consideration. The human cost of this inequality cannot be overstated. Workers are pushed to take on multiple jobs. Parents are forced to choose between paying bills and saving for their children's education. And young people are starting their lives buried under debt that previous generations could never have imagined. Meanwhile, the rhetoric from above insists that people should simply work harder, hustle more, or take greater personal responsibility. But the evidence shows the opposite. Americans are already working longer hours than workers in most other industrialized nations, with less vacation time, fewer benefits, and weaker social protections. What we are witnessing is not laziness or poor choices at the bottom, but exploitation and hoarding at the top. When inequality reaches this level, the consequences spill beyond economics. Politics itself becomes poison because extreme concentrations of wealth inevitably translate into extreme concentrations of power. Campaign contributions, lobbying, media ownership, and think tank funding all become tools for the wealthy to ensure that public policy reflects their interests rather than the needs of the majority. The result is a democracy in name, but an oligarchy in practice. This explains why policies that enjoy overwhelming popular support, such as raising the minimum wage, expanding health care access, or taxing the wealthy, are consistently blocked, watered down, or delayed. The system bends to those who can afford to pay for its attention, leaving everyone else increasingly alienated from the political process. History shows us that such levels of inequality are not sustainable. Societies that allow wealth to accumulate so dramatically in the hands of a few eventually face crises that cannot be contained. Economic instability grows because consumer demand weakens when the majority cannot afford to spend. Social unrest increases as frustration builds among those who feel excluded and exploited. Political institutions lose legitimacy when they are perceived as serving only the elite. These pressures mount until the system either undergoes a fundamental transformation or collapses under the weight of its contradictions. We are approaching that threshold now. Whether the ruling class acknowledges it or not, the narrative that inequality is the inevitable price of growth is collapsing under the weight of its own falsehoods. Growth in wealth and productivity has been enormous over the last decades, but its benefits have been distributed upward, not outward. A society that prioritizes stock buybacks over wages, speculation over social investment, and tax shelters over public goods is a society eating away at its own foundations. The myth that a rising tide lifts all boats has been disproven by the reality that only a handful of yachts have risen while most people are left struggling to stay afloat. What makes this moment so dangerous yet so full of potential is that inequality at this scale creates conditions for profound change. It forces questions about legitimacy, about justice, about the very purpose of an economy. It reveals the contradictions that capitalism cannot resolve on its own. How to reconcile endless accumulation with the needs of the many. How to balance corporate power with democratic accountability. How to maintain social stability when the majority feels abandoned. The answers to these questions are not yet determined, but what is clear is that the status quo cannot endure. Inequality has reached a breaking point, and with it, the very system that produced it is being pushed to its limits. The signs of worker rebellion that are emerging across the United States and beyond are not isolated incidents, nor are they simply temporary expressions of frustration. They represent a deeper awakening among working people who, after decades of being told to accept less, are beginning to recognize their own power and their collective capacity to shape the future. What we are witnessing is not only an increase in strikes or workplace actions, but the early stages of a cultural and political shift in how workers understand their place in the economy. For too long, corporations and political leaders have presented the workplace as a one-way relationship in which employees are expected to be grateful for whatever wages and conditions are offered. That narrative is beginning to break down. Consider the wave of strikes that has swept through industries once considered too essential or too fragmented to organize effectively. Teachers, nurses, warehouse employees, delivery drivers, auto workers, and service employees are all demanding more, not only in terms of wages, but in recognition of their dignity and humanity. They are refusing to accept the idea that they should sacrifice their health, their families, and their futures to preserve the profits of shareholders and executives. These actions are not small disruptions. They are signals that the working class, long dismissed as passive and resigned, is beginning to flex its muscles in ways that could reshape the balance of power in the economy. At the same time, we see quieter but equally telling forms of resistance. The phenomenon of quiet quitting, often mocked or misunderstood by commentators, reflects a refusal by workers to continue giving more than they receive. It is a rejection of the expectation that loyalty, unpaid overtime, and emotional sacrifice should be standard features of modern employment. Mass resignations in sectors like hospitality, retail, and logistics highlight the same dynamic. People are choosing when possible to leave exploitative jobs rather than endure them. While not as dramatic as a strike, these decisions reveal a growing recognition among workers that their labor is not just a commodity, but the very foundation of the economy. The underlying driver of this rebellion is the long-standing imbalance between rising productivity and stagnant wages. Workers know, whether through lived experience or observation, that they are generating more wealth for corporations than ever before. Yet their share of that wealth has not grown. The pandemic made this contradiction impossible to ignore. Essential workers were praised as heroes, but when it came to compensation and protections, they were treated as expendable. Meanwhile, executives and investors profited handsomely during the very same crisis. That memory lingers, fueling a sense of betrayal and a determination not to return to the old normal that demanded sacrifice from workers while rewarding only those at the top. This rebellion also carries broader implications for society as a whole. When workers challenge corporations, they are also challenging the political system that enables corporate dominance. Strikes are not only about wages, they are about who controls decision making in an economy that affects everyone's lives. Each work stoppage, each demand for better conditions implicitly raises a larger question. Why should a handful of executives have the power to decide the fate of thousands when it is the workers who create the value that sustains the enterprise? Questions chip away at the legitimacy of a system that has long hidden behind the language of efficiency and competitiveness. It is important to recognize that such rebellion is often uneven, fragmented, and messy. Not every strike succeeds. Not every resignation leads to change, and not every act of resistance is visible. But taken together, these developments point to a broader trend. The working class is reasserting itself as a political force. The history of labor struggles shows us that transformative change rarely begins with grand revolutions. It begins with countless smaller acts of defiance that accumulate until they can no longer be contained. That is precisely the stage we are entering now. The corporate elite understands this better than many ordinary people. They are responding with strategies designed to undermine, co-opt, or suppress this new wave of worker activism, anti-UN campaigns, contract delays, and efforts to pit workers against one another are evidence of a ruling class that feels its grip loosening. Such responses, while effective in the short term, often backfire in the long run by deepening resentment and reinforcing the very solidarity they seek to undermine. Each confrontation teaches workers new lessons about their strength and about the vulnerabilities of those who depend on their labor. The rebellion of workers is not merely about better paychecks or improved benefits. It is about redefining what work means in a society where the balance of power has tilted too far toward profit and away from human needs. It is about reclaiming dignity in a world where labor has been devalued and treated as disposable. And most importantly, it is about laying the groundwork for a future in which the economy is organized not for the enrichment of a few, but for the well-being of the many. The rumblings we hear today are not the end of this story. They are the beginning of a transformation that could change not just workplaces, but the very structure of society. When societies reach a moment of deep crisis, the direction of change is never predetermined. The future does not arrive as a single path laid before us, but rather as a fork in the road, a set of choices that depend on the level of awareness, organization, and determination among ordinary people. At this moment, we are standing on that fork, and two futures are becoming increasingly clear. If the majority of people remain passive, uninformed, and divided, then the forces of wealth and power will seize the crises of our time as opportunities to expand their control. They will use fear, confusion, and desperation to deepen inequality and reinforce a system that already favors them. But if people awaken to the structural nature of these crises, if they connect their shared struggles and organize around solutions that put human needs first, then the same crises can become turning points toward a more democratic, equitable, and sustainable society. The first path, the one favored by elites, is already visible in the way current crises are managed. Inflation, for instance, is routinely presented as a natural occurrence, as though it were the weather, when in reality it reflects deliberate corporate strategies of price gouging and profit maximization. Yet, rather than addressing those root causes, policymakers respond with measures that disproportionately burden working people, such as raising interest rates that increase debt costs and risk unemployment. The same pattern emerges with the housing crisis, the healthcare system, and climate change. The ruling class frames each problem in ways that protect their wealth and privileges while shifting the costs onto those least able to bear them. If left unchallenged, this approach will not only maintain inequality, but intensify it, trapping millions in cycles of insecurity while consolidating even greater power at the top. The second path, the one that emerges if people resist, requires something very different. It begins with the recognition that these crises are not acts of nature, but outcomes of a system designed to prioritize profit over people. When workers strike, when communities demand affordable housing, when young people insist on climate action, they are refusing to accept the narrative of inevitability. They are asserting that alternatives exist and that society has the capacity to reorganize itself around fairness and sustainability. On this path, crises become catalysts for change, forcing questions that the ruling class has long tried to suppress. Why should health care be tied to employment? Why should housing be treated as a commodity instead of a human right? Why should fossil fuel corporations dictate the pace of climate policy? The choice between these futures is not abstract. History is filled with examples of societies that faced crisis and turned either toward repression or toward liberation. In some cases, economic collapse led to authoritarian regimes that promised stability while stripping away freedoms. In others, mass mobilization and solidarity transformed moments of hardship into the foundation for social progress. Expanding labor rights, building welfare systems, and democratizing political institutions, which outcome prevails, depends not on the severity of the crisis itself, but on how people respond to it. Awareness, organization, and the willingness to act collectively are the deciding factors. At present, those in power are betting on passivity. They rely on a population too overwhelmed or too divided to resist. They deploy the language of inevitability. There is no alternative to discourage people from imagining different futures. They stoke division along racial, regional, and partisan lines to prevent solidarity, and they use the machinery of media to normalize suffering, convincing people that their struggles are simply the cost of living in a modern economy. This strategy works only so long as people remain isolated in their pain. Once connections are made, once individuals realize that their problems are shared and systemic, the potential for collective action multiplies. This is why the present moment is so volatile. On one hand, the tools of distraction and control remain powerful, and many people still accept the idea that nothing fundamental can change. On the other hand, discontent is growing, and more workers, students, and communities are recognizing that their frustrations stem from the same root causes. Every strike, every protest, every campaign that challenges the logic of profit-first economics is a reminder that the second path is not only possible, but already being sketched out in practice. The real danger and the real opportunity lies in the fact that crises are intensifying. Climate disasters grow more frequent, economic shocks more severe, political dysfunction more blatant. These pressures make it harder for elites to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but pressure alone does not determine the outcome. Without organization, anger can be manipulated, redirected into scapegoating or nationalism. With organization, that same anger can fuel movements that demand structural transformation. The crossroads we face then is stark. Allow crises to deepen inequality under elite management or seize them as openings for democratic renewal. The future will be decided not by abstract forces, but by the choices made collectively in the struggles of the present. History has a way of moving with or without the permission of those who live through it. At certain moments, the pressure of accumulated contradictions becomes too great, and the old order can no longer contain the forces it has unleashed. That is where we find ourselves today. People may continue with their daily routines, distracted by headlines and absorbed by personal struggles, but beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of society are shifting. The gap between what the system promises and what it delivers has grown too wide, and the institutions that once provided stability are losing legitimacy. Change is not optional at this point, it is inevitable. The only question is whether people will recognize this in time to shape it, or whether they will be carried along as passive spectators of transformations imposed from above. The illusion that history is stable is one of the most effective tools of the ruling class. People are told that things may be difficult, but fundamentally stable, that the system may bend, but it will not break. This belief keeps individuals focused on survival within the existing framework rather than considering how that framework itself could be altered. Yet history consistently disproves this illusion. Empires fall, economies collapse, political regimes give way to new forms of governance. What seems unshakable in one generation becomes unrecognizable in the next. The idea that the present system of corporate capitalism is immune to this pattern is not only arrogant, but dangerously naive. Signs of impending transformation are everywhere. Economically, we see mounting debt burdens, speculative bubbles, and a global system stretched thin by interdependence and volatility. Socially, there is rising discontent evident in protests, labor actions, and the widespread sense among younger generations that the future being offered to them is worse than the one their parents enjoyed. Politically, gridlock and dysfunction erode faith in democratic institutions, creating fertile ground for both authoritarian appeals and grassroots alternatives. Environmental pressures add yet another dimension as climate change accelerates and natural disasters expose the inability of markets to provide collective solutions. Each of these crises alone could destabilize a society. Together they form a storm that no amount of denial or distraction can permanently hold back. The danger lies in the fact that when systems reach breaking points, they can move in directions that deepen oppression as easily as they can move toward liberation. If people do not act, if they resign themselves to powerlessness, then history will still move, but in ways dictated by those with wealth and influence. Elites have already shown their ability to adapt crisis to their advantage. Economic downturns become excuses for austerity measures. Security threats justify surveillance and repression. Environmental disasters are used to privatize resources. In this sense, passivity is not neutrality, it is consent to a future in which inequality and control grow even more extreme. Yet, history also shows the opposite possibility. When people refuse to remain spectators, when they organize and act collectively, crises can become turning points toward more democratic and just arrangements. The labor movements of the past, the civil rights struggles, the expansion of social safety nets, all were born in times of deep conflict and instability. What transformed those moments from breakdown into progress was not luck or inevitability, but conscious action by ordinary people who refused to accept the limits imposed on them. They understood that while history does not wait, it also does not dictate. It opens doors that can be walked through if enough people are willing to step forward. What makes the present moment so urgent is that awareness of these dynamics is beginning to spread. Workers, students, and communities are increasingly aware that their struggles are interconnected and that their fates are tied to the choices they make together. Every organizing campaign, every protest, every demand for accountability is a rehearsal for larger battles to come. These actions may seem small in isolation, but together they form the foundation of a movement that could intervene in history rather than being swept along by it. To grasp this moment requires courage, the courage to admit that stability is an illusion, that waiting for things to improve on their own is a form of surrender, and that responsibility for the future cannot be outsourced to politicians, corporations, or experts. It requires understanding that history is not a distant force, but the sum of human choices made in conditions not of our choosing. And it requires recognizing that while the forces aligned against change are powerful, they are not invincible. Their strength lies in people's passivity. Their weakness is exposed the moment people decide to act. History will not pause to give society more time. It is already moving, already reshaping the conditions under which we live. People have no idea what's about to happen because they have been taught to believe that nothing fundamental can change. But the reality is that everything is changing, and quickly choice before us is whether to remain spectators watching as the powerful impose their vision of the future or to become the authors of a different story, one that reflects the needs, hopes, and dignity of the many rather than the privileges of the few. So, my friends, the question is not whether change is coming. The question is, will it be change imposed on us from above or change built by us from below? That is what's about to happen. And that is what we must decide. Let me close with this. History doesn't wait for permission. It moves with or without us. And right now, people have no idea what's about to happen, but you do. You see the signs. You feel the tension. You know that the old order is collapsing under its own contradictions. So the task before us is simple but urgent. Prepare, organize, and educate, because when the storm arrives, and it is arriving, we must not be spectators. We must be the authors of what comes next. Thank you.